In my view, the cleanest way to understand this whole saga is to treat it like a political thought experiment. One of those, what if the cameras weren't there and the talking points didn't work scenarios that reveals what power sounds like when it stops pretending to be polite. Picture a cold winter afternoon in the Oval Office, the kind of gray day where Washington looks like it's been desaturated on purpose. Governor Gavin Newsom walks in, convinced he's stepping onto a familiar stage, ready to deliver the same highlight reel lines he's used 100 times. He's upright, composed, and clearly prepared to speak first, because that's what ambitious politicians do when they think momentum is armor. And then Donald Trump cuts straight through the opener with a flat, almost bored command that doesn't ask for permission: sit down. Newsom, in this scenario, starts the way you'd expect a California governor to start when he wants to sound above the fray. He frames California as the proof-of-concept state, a place that thrives even when Washington drags its feet. He gestures toward the familiar scoreboard: economic scale, climate policies, innovation, diversity, like he's presenting quarterly results to a skeptical board. There's a faint edge of condescension in it too, the kind that says, "I'm here because you called, not because I needed to." If the point is to imply the president is jealous, the implication lands before the words even finish forming. Trump doesn't raise his voice in this version because he doesn't have to. He doesn't need the theatrics. The control is in the timing and the silence. His tone is clinical, like a landlord reading a lease clause out loud. He lets Newsom's confidence hang in the air for a beat, and then punctures it with a single number that's meant to do the talking. Not a slogan, not a nickname, just a figure that sounds like it belongs in a spreadsheet and a court file: $68 billion. The claim, presented as the centerpiece of the confrontation, is that California spent $68 billion on homelessness programs since Newsom took office in 2019. Then comes the second piece of the punch, delivered like a cashier stating the total. The homeless count rose anyway, by roughly 46%. In that moment, the argument isn't partisan, it's arithmetic. If you spend that kind of money and the problem grows, what exactly did the money buy, besides speeches and press releases? Trump slides a thick folder forward with one finger and asks a question that sounds simple precisely because it's hard to answer cleanly. Where did it go? What makes the room feel different in this imagined telling is who's standing behind the desk. Not political aides with grins, and not TV-friendly surrogates, but officials with binders that look heavy enough to leave a dent in the furniture. You've got FBI Director Christopher Wray in the background with a stack that screams paper trail, not press conference. You've got Treasury represented by Scott Bessent, framed as the numbers person who doesn't speak until the data is ready to speak for him. And you've got a HUD Inspector General, Ray Oliver Davis, positioned like the auditor who's seen every trick and is tired of pretending surprise. Newsom, still standing at first, plays the political theater card because it's the card politicians reach for when the room turns unfamiliar. He laughs, the practiced kind, like he's trying to shrink the moment back down to something he can manage. He hints this is revenge, old grudges, partisan obsession. The usual story about Washington targeting California for being California. He says he's not intimidated, because that line is muscle memory by now. But the moment the numbers start stacking up, even the best muscle memory starts to shake. Trump, in this version, doesn't argue ideology. He claims to argue receipts. He frames the $68 billion as a moral indictment. Not because homelessness is a great talking point, but because it's a problem you can see with your eyes. The accusation is never shouted. It's suggested with confidence, which is often more unsettling. He implies the spending became a pipeline, money moved, people stayed desperate, and the folks with connections did better than the folks sleeping outside. And he says, without theatrical flourish, that he can back it up. When Ray steps forward, the story shifts from confrontation to presentation. The claim is that an 8-month federal review has been running quietly in the background, not as a political stunt, but as a forensic audit. They talk about contracts, bank records, filings, and testimony, the kind of language that's designed to sound nonpartisan, even when the consequences are political. They describe a pattern rather than a single scandal, which is always more dangerous because patterns are harder to explain away. And they say they've identified roughly $23 billion in spending that appears, at minimum, difficult to justify on its face. To keep it from sounding like gossip, they start with what they call one concrete example. A nonprofit, described as California Housing Solutions, is said to have received $340 million across several years. The output, as presented, is about 400 units of supportive housing, which is then converted into a cost per unit that sounds almost cartoonish. The math lands at around $850,000 per unit, which is compared to a rough market benchmark of about $200,000 per unit. And the question they keep returning to isn't who's guilty, but how does the gap get that big without anyone noticing? From there, the narrative claims the money didn't evaporate. It simply took detours. The nonprofit, they say, paid huge sums to consulting firms and subcontractors. Those firms, according to this presentation, have connections: former campaign staff, major donors, political advisors, familiar names in familiar circles. They describe invoices that look inflated and deliverables that sound vague, the kind of strategic oversight language that can mean anything and therefore prove nothing. And they suggest that if you trace enough of those payments, you end up circling back toward the political ecosystem that keeps the machine humming. It's important, in a story like this, to keep the framing cautious, because the line between pattern and proof is where reputations go to die. So the officials, as portrayed here, avoid declaring motives and focus on what they claim they can document. They talk about bid processes, or the lack of them, and how no bid can be legal while still being a breeding ground for bad incentives. They talk about prices that don't match the market, and paperwork that doesn't match the promises. And they say the pattern repeats across multiple entities, which is how the number grows from a weird contract to a terrifying total. Then Treasury's portion arrives, and the focus pivots from public money to private benefit. Besant, described as crisp and methodical, brings up Newsom's family-linked wine and hospitality interests, including Plumpjack Group, Odette Estate Winery, and Cade Winery. The claim is that these businesses received a combined $47 million in contracts, subsidies, tax breaks, or credits during Newsom's tenure. The presentation frames this as the kind of conflict of interest territory that doesn't require a dramatic villain monologue to look bad. They cite state rules in broad strokes and imply the ethical problem is less about one signature and more about influence and benefit lining up too neatly. In this telling, Besant doesn't say, "You personally approved it," because that's the kind of sentence that starts fights you can't finish. Instead, the point becomes structural. Leaders appoint people, set priorities, and shape incentives, and then plausible deniability blooms like algae. They compare the claimed benefits to what similar operations received, highlighting disparities as if the disparities are the story. They suggest the improvements at one winery don't match the scale of the credits, leaving a gap that begs for an explanation. And they paint the whole thing as textbook self-dealing, not as a verdict, but as a warning label. Next comes the political money diagram. because nothing makes an audience lean forward like a flowchart. Ray, as framed here, claims they cross-referenced top donor lists with state contract awards. They present a ratio that sounds too clean to be coincidence. Donors put in dollars. Contracts pay out many times over. They call it pay-to-play, without insisting that every transaction was a bribe, which is a clever way to imply a conclusion without having to prove intent in the room. And they frame it as an investment return model, which is the language that tends to make the public feel nauseous. Specific names appear in this hypothetical briefing because specificity is what makes a narrative feel real. They mention Tom Steyer as a major climate world figure whose orbit overlaps with politics and money in ways most regular people will never fully map. They mention entities like consulting shops and lobbying groups as the connective tissue, because that's where accountability tends to go to hide. They cite donors like Jeremy Stoppelman and others in a way that reads less like a final list and more like a set of illustrative examples. And they keep repeating the same question in different outfits. If this was all above board, why does it look like a closed loop? The story also leans into the idea that the easiest way to understand a money story is to follow what happens after the payment clears. So they describe wire transfers from contractors to shell entities, from shell entities to political consultants, from consultants to independent expenditures, and back into the ecosystem. They use terms like money laundering and fraud as labels for the pattern, while still presenting them as the government's theory rather than a settled judgment. They emphasize documentation, bank records, transfers, filings, because documentation is harder to dismiss as spin, and the rhythm becomes relentless. Contract, payment, consultant, donation, repeat. At some point, an Inspector General, Davis in this case, brings up the lifestyle layer, because the public always cares about the lifestyle layer. The story references the French laundry dinner, not as the main scandal, but as the appetizer the public already tasted. They claim the dinner was paid by a lobbying group, and they describe that as a reporting issue under state ethics rules. They then widen the lens to other pricey dinners and trips, presented as gifts, sponsorship, or politically convenient hospitality that blurs the line between work and indulgence. They treat it as a pattern of unreported benefits, not because one dinner proves corruption, but because repetition can suggest expectation. In a more careful telling, you'd say, maybe some of it was legal, maybe some of it was sloppy, maybe some of it was ethically gross, but technically permitted. That ambiguity is precisely what makes it explosive, because ambiguity invites argument, and argument drives attention. They claim dozens of high-end dinners, many not apparently paid directly by Newsom, and imply that's a disclosure problem at minimum. They describe travel that looks like fundraising on paper and vacation in practice, which is the kind of detail that doesn't need a prosecutor to feel suspicious. And they frame it as the difference between public image and private reality, which is always a politically lethal contrast. Then the presentation tries to bring the story back to the people on the street, because without human cost, it's just accounting. They describe interviews with unhoused Californians and veterans who say they can't access services and have been waiting for years. They present rising homeless deaths, suggesting a grim backdrop against which any alleged mismanagement looks more unforgivable. They frame it as a moral failure first, a legal failure second, which is a potent order if you're trying to keep the audience emotionally engaged. And they imply that even if every dime was technically spent, the outcomes are damning enough to demand answers. Now comes the legal thunder. The word RICO. In this scenario, the White House counsel lays out the theory like a lecture, because counsel always sounds like counsel. They explain that RICO is designed to prosecute ongoing enterprises built on repeated crimes, not just one-off misconduct. They list categories: wire fraud, mail fraud, honest services fraud, conspiracy, presented as potential predicates that could create a pattern. They emphasize that prosecutors don't need a cartoon mobster. They need an organization, a pattern, and participation. This is where the narrative turns into a choice, because choices are what keep viewers listening. Trump, in this telling, offers two paths that both end badly, but one ends less badly. Option 1 is resignation and state-level prosecution, the kind of controlled fall that preserves some dignity and limits exposure. Option 2 is refusal, followed by public release of the audit and federal charges that carry the kind of numbers that swallow the rest of your life. The menace is not shouted. It's implied through certainty, which is always scarier than rage. Newsom, seated now, is described as shrinking in real time, not because a grown man physically shrinks, but because the room has gotten bigger than him. His posture collapses, the way posture collapses when someone realizes charisma can't pay bail. He tries to push back with, "You can't prove it," which is what anyone says when they're stalling for oxygen. Trump, as written here, answers with the language of an auctioneer. Contracts, bank records, sworn testimony, emails, text messages. The message is that the argument isn't about ideology, it's about paper. There's also a psychological trick embedded in the presentation. They claim immunity deals exist. They suggest contractors have already agreed to talk, which implies the wall of silence has cracked. They present it as a domino situation, where the smaller fish already saved themselves by giving up the bigger fish. Whether that would hold in reality is a separate question, but in a narrative, it creates a sense of inevitability. And inevitability is what makes resignation sound less like a decision and more like gravity. In this hypothetical, Newsom asks for lawyers and time, because that's what anyone asks for when the ground shifts. Trump says no, because no is the word that demonstrates power faster than any policy memo. The counsel describes state charges, fraud, embezzlement, public corruption, in broad terms that sound plausible even when nothing is adjudicated in the room. They float a plea scenario. 10 years, maybe 6 served, a contained disaster rather than an endless one. They position it as the best possible outcome, which is a phrase people only hear when there are no good outcomes left. Newsom tries one last reframing, politically motivated, targeting the opposition, punishing California's resistance. Trump's reply, in this version, is blunt. This is about being a crook, not about being progressive. It's a harsh line, and to keep it from sounding like a direct accusation presented as fact, you'd frame it as Trump's claim, not the narrator's conclusion. Even so, the sting is in the simplicity. I'm doing it because you're corrupt. The scene treats that simplicity like a club. Then comes the countdown gimmick, because American politics loves a timer. 60 seconds to decide is less about fairness and more about dominance. Ray adds a note that sounds almost sympathetic, the career investigator line about having seen this before. The message is, you can't spin bank records, you can't debate wire transfers, you can't charm a ledger. And as the seconds pass, the story leans into the humiliation of someone who thought he was untouchable learning he's touchable. In the end, Newsom says he'll resign. Trump doesn't celebrate, which in a narrative reads as colder and therefore more confident. He offers the standard public excuse menu, family, health, personal reasons, because politics always provides a soft landing story even when the fall is hard. He warns against running or fighting because in this telling the leverage is the threat of exposure and escalation. And he ends with the kind of moralizing line presidents love to deliver when they want to sound like they're speaking for history rather than themselves. Newsom leaves the Oval Office described as broken, and that's where the narrative pivots into aftermath. Late that night, a resignation statement goes out, effective immediately, and the world reacts the way it always reacts to sudden political exits, with speculation. The successor named is Eleni Kounalakis, which gives the story the stamp of procedural realism. Trump stays quiet publicly, which in a media environment can be read as either restraint or strategy. And because nobody gets a clean break anymore, the next beat is a press conference. 2 days later in this scenario, California Attorney General Rob Bonta announces charges. The key twist is that Bonta is a Democrat, which is meant to undercut the purely partisan hit framing. The narrative claims the evidence came from federal investigators and that the alleged fraudulent portion centers around that $23 billion figure. It also claims self-dealing and donor enrichment are part of the pattern, presented again as allegations with documentation rather than definitive truth. And then it leans into the media turn, because the media turn is where reputations go to be eaten alive. The story has outlets like the Los Angeles Times and the San Francisco Chronicle pivot from protective coverage to aggressive coverage. It describes headlines that ask where the money went, and it frames the investigation as the kind that becomes unavoidable once too many documents exist. It suggests even friendly ideological outlets would struggle to defend what looks, from the outside, like a money story with human victims. Newsom attempts a PR response: persecution, exaggeration, political revenge, but the narrative says the public doesn't buy it. Whether that would happen exactly that way is debatable, but the point of the story is that credibility evaporates fast when numbers are that large. By April, the scenario says a plea deal lands. Newsom pleads guilty to 5 counts and gets a 10-year sentence with an expectation of serving around 6. A judge delivers a blistering statement about betrayal of trust, which is the kind of courtroom rhetoric the public loves because it sounds final. The narrative places him at California State Prison, Solano, with an inmate number, because details like that create the feeling of reality even in a dramatized account. And the contrast is hammered, from governor's mansion to prison cell, from cover story charisma to fluorescent anonymity. 5 years pass quickly in the narrative because montage time is political time. Newsom is described as older, grayer, less glossy, working in the prison library, waiting for parole eligibility. His business interests survive but rebrand, scrubbing the name, because brands hate controversy more than they hate hypocrisy. The story claims sales dropped sharply, then partially recovered, reflecting how public outrage burns hot and then makes room for convenience. It says fines and legal fees drained his wealth, leaving him comfortable but diminished, which is the kind of consequence audiences interpret as not enough. The personal fallout is included because politics in America always becomes soap opera. Jennifer Siebel Newsom divorces him, changes back to her maiden name, and the children distance themselves. The narrative emphasizes isolation, because isolation is a punishment people can visualize. It suggests he becomes a cautionary tale, taught in political science courses, compared to other notorious governors like Rod Blagojevich. And it frames his legacy as something simple and brutal. Not policies, not ambition, not style, just scandal. Eventually, a reporter seeks him out, because the media never leaves a fallen figure alone if there's still a quote to squeeze out. The story has the San Francisco Chronicle securing an interview conducted in a private room with Newsom wearing prison-issued clothing. He's asked about regret, and he offers a cold answer: regret for getting caught. because narratives like this often want the villain to be disappointing, not repentant. He rationalizes the system, suggests everyone does it, implies he was singled out, which is how political self-justification usually sounds when it's cornered. The reporter pushes back, noting Democrats charged him. A Democrat judge sentenced him. California voters would have been the jury. And the story uses that pushback to puncture the persecution claim. When asked what he'll do after release, he says he'll disappear somewhere like Montana. The narrative makes a point of saying he can't return to politics or law, which is meant to feel like banishment. It frames his future as quiet and small, because that's the opposite of what he chased. It also underscores how quickly the world moves on, because American politics eats new scandals for breakfast. And it ends the interview segment with the most damning kind of line. He wanted power more than he wanted to be honest. Back in Washington, Trump is asked about Newsom again, and he responds in a way that frames himself as the custodian of consequence. He says justice was served, that Newsom got off easy, and that California got new leadership. He denies he ended anything, insisting Newsom ended his own ambitions because that's how powerful people rewrite the story as moral inevitability. Whether you believe that or not depends on how you read power and how you read narrative. But the line is designed to sound like the final word, even when history rarely gives final words. The epilogue swings back to homelessness, because that's the original moral hook. The story claims oversight tightened under the new administration, audits increased, transparency improved. It admits the crisis remains severe because real problems don't vanish just because one figure falls. It offers a small human resolution, someone from the interviews eventually getting housing, because stories like this need at least one thread that doesn't end in darkness. And it closes by suggesting the future record will be merciless, the kind of summary that reduces a complicated career to a single ugly sentence. If you listen to all of that as a piece of American political commentary rather than a sworn statement, the point isn't to declare anyone's guilt like a judge. The point is to hold up an uncomfortable mirror. How can systems move that much money, produce outcomes that bad, and still keep the same people smiling for cameras? How often do voters get sold a narrative of progress, while the underlying paperwork tells a different story? How many programs become brands, and how many initiatives become ecosystems where insiders do better than the people being served? And when the numbers get huge, tens of billions, how long can any leader hide behind vibes and speeches before someone starts asking for receipts? I'm not asking you to treat this as a verdict, because verdicts belong in courtrooms, not in voiceovers. I'm asking you to notice what the story is really about. Incentives, accountability, and the way moral language gets used as cover for messy, unglamorous realities. If the outcomes are that grim, shouldn't someone be forced to explain the gap, even if no crime is ever proven in the end? If a state can spend enough money to reshape an entire crisis, and the crisis still grows, isn't skepticism the only rational emotion left? And if a politician builds a brand on competence and compassion, doesn't that brand deserve the harshest questions when the results look like failure? That's the tension this scenario is trying to weaponize from the first sentence to the last. A glossy public image walks into a room expecting a debate and finds something closer to an audit. A system built on narratives collides with a system built on paperwork, and the audience, watching from the outside, is left with the most American question of all. If you really wanted to prove where the money went, would anyone powerful actually let you look? And that last question is the one that lingers after the credits roll, because it's not really about Gavin Newsom or Donald Trump as individual characters in a drama. It's about what happens in a country where every side insists it's saving the republic, while the paperwork quietly keeps its own score in the background. If you're a voter, you're told to pick a team, pick a vibe, pick a storyline, and then clap when your side wins the day. But what does winning even mean if the visible crisis stays visible? If the tents don't go away? If the waiting lists don't shrink? If the historic investment becomes a phrase people roll their eyes at instead of a promise they can trust? Here's the uncomfortable part. The public rarely gets to see the boring middle where accountability either happens or doesn't. We get the speeches, the viral clips, the righteous outrage, the dramatic resignations, and the carefully worded statements about family reasons. We almost never get the full, ugly, unfiltered chain of decisions. Who approved what? Who signed which memo? Who waived which rule? Who got invited to which meeting? Who knew what and when? And when we don't get that, the vacuum fills with whatever story people already wanted to believe. Some will swear it was a politically timed takedown. Others will swear it was long overdue justice. Most people, if they're being honest, will admit they don't know, and they're tired of pretending they do. So the real ending isn't a gavel slam or a triumphant press conference. The real ending is a quieter, more cynical shift. Regular people stop expecting government programs to work the way they're advertised and start assuming the system is designed to reward the connected first. That's how trust dies in America, not in one dramatic scandal, but in 1,000 moments when the official story doesn't match what you can see outside your car window. And once that mindset spreads, it doesn't matter who the next governor is or which party controls the White House, because the public's default setting becomes suspicion. The only way back from that isn't another speech. It's transparency that feels real, oversight that doesn't wink, and numbers that actually move in the right direction for the people who don't have lobbyists, donors, or a seat at the table.